on-demand replay for TMA 2023 is generously sponsored by Pinney Associates.
Good morning. You're all very good looking this morning. So I really wanted to thank TMA, the board, and the FDA for being here, and everyone. I think this panel was not originally first, and I'm really happy that it moved to first on the agenda because, you know, this is as Chris said, you know, foundational. This is the heart of everything we do. Just a little bit on housekeeping. You'll notice two lovely speakers here, one speaker in the ether. Unfortunately, Matt Holman will be unable to join us today, which is unfortunate, but he does keep his streak of making my life difficult going past, you know, into its 13th, 14th year, so congrats to him on that. We're gonna have I'm gonna kick off with a little sort of place setting for us to kind of see where we are. Then we're gonna have a couple talks, first Jessica, then Cliff, then Thad. I would request that after each person's talk, clarifying questions are okay, but let's keep the bigger issues for a more broader discussion at the end, because I think there'll be a lot to talk about. So as I said, I think this is a fantastic place to start because really this nicotine, it's in the plants that we grow, it's in the products we design, it's in the products we sell, it's in the products we use, it's in the products that our consumers use. So it's the substance that drives the behavior, right? I think that's the best way to think about nicotine, but it's also really poorly understood, you know. I studied nicotine as a major part of my PhD dissertation, and I'm probably at like 60% understanding of nicotines, because it's a really complex molecule and it works in the body in a lot of different ways. But the problem is that consumers have a really large misunderstanding of it, and it drives what products they use, it drives which products they're willing to try, and these misperceptions can really get people in the wrong spot on the continuum of risk. So I think today what we want to really talk about is what these misperceptions are. I don't think we can get to all of them, but I think we can do a really good job. Where these misperceptions are coming from. Why do people think this about nicotine? How do these misperceptions actually drive their behavior and what impact that can have on the individual and population level? And then hopefully in the broader discussion, we can maybe come up with some solutions about how we can correct these misperceptions, and we being the sort of royal we, you know, the people in this room, agencies, and maybe who the drivers of the change could be. So again, thanks for being here. Do I have a screen? Do I have a clicker? Aha. Okay. Okay, so terminology is important, so I put this one up. A misperception is a wrong or incorrect understanding or interpretation. It is believing something that is incorrect or false. Misinformation is false information that is spread regardless of whether there is intent to mislead. A good way to think about this is kind of a rumor or a myth, right? Something that is incorrect but is widely circulated. And then disinformation. Disinformation is deliberately misleading or biased information, manipulated narrative or facts, AKA propaganda. This is intentional misleading. So I think we're going to talk about these a lot today, but mostly focus on the misperception piece. So facts, we just talked about facts. So let's start with a good one. Does nicotine cause cancer? I think this is a really nice example because we have a lot of data on how consumers think about this question, but we also have a lot of data on whether or not nicotine causes cancer. And I just picked a couple from, I would say, a pretty authoritative list. You know, the FDA says the mix of chemicals, not nicotine, is what causes serious disease and death in tobacco users. Cancer Research UK, nicotine does not cause cancer. Health Canada, nicotine itself is not known to cause cancer. WHO, does nicotine cause cancer? No. And national academies, there is no human evidence to support the hypothesis that nicotine is a human carcinogen. So I'd say this is pretty well established fact. These are some pretty authoritative sources. So we can be working under the assumption that it is true that nicotine does not cause cancer. Now, if we ask consumers about this question, with the question, how much do you agree or disagree that the nicotine in cigarettes is the substance that causes most of the cancer by smoking, you can see that the responses are not great. So we can just focus on 2019 here. The dark blue is that they strongly agree with this, so you have about a third of people. The lighter blue is that they agree, that's another quarter, and then another 20% don't know. And that means that somewhere around the range of 75% of people think that nicotine is what causes the cancer from using tobacco products. I put a little time lapse on here, or time series, so we can see how it's changed over time. Not huge changes, but it's getting worse. And the strongly agree, you can see, has gone up, and the overall number who don't know the facts about nicotine and cancer is also increasing over time. So that's not super. But you know, people talk to their physicians when they need to know things about their health or what they could be doing to make things better. So, you know, there was this study out of Rutgers, which was quite good, where they talked to physicians, different specialties, and asked them this. And you can see here, when you ask physicians, please indicate the extent to which you agree or disagree that nicotine directly contributes to the development of cancer. A huge percentage of physicians strongly agree with this. A couple more agree, and very few get this correct. So if you're a consumer going to your physician for advice on nicotine, advice on reduced risk products, it may not be the most informed source. So this study, when it came out, was quite alarming. And these researchers are really top notch. So what they did is they went back and they asked the question a different way, right? So what they asked was, please indicate the extent to which you agree or disagree that nicotine on its own directly contributes to the development of cancer. Things got a little better, but not great. Still, a vast majority of physicians strongly agree or agree that nicotine is what is causing cancer in users of tobacco products. So consumers don't seem to get it. Physicians don't seem to get it. I just gave you guys a nice lesson on it like 2 slides ago, so you guys got it down, so that's perfect. But you know, if we're thinking about, you know, where we want to be reducing the death and disease caused by tobacco products, we want to make sure that we're reaching everyone. And so in a really nice paper out of Hopkins recently, they looked at the 2016 PATH data, and what they found here was that 61.2% of smokers incorrectly believe that nicotine causes cancer, or probably causes cancer, or they didn't know. And when we look at how the people in this study break down, you can see that, okay, so this is ratios, so 1 is going to be kind of your reference, and everything else is fold that, right? So you can see, so in this group, non-Hispanic white is going to be the reference population, but the incorrect beliefs about nicotine and cancer are much higher among non-Hispanic black, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic other. So there's really differences in the population level among different groups on these misperceptions. We can go further. If we look by age, here we have 18 to 24 being the reference group. And you can see that, you know, if you're under 34, you're doing okay. But really, in the older age, 45 to 75 plus, which are the groups that are at most risk from complications due to tobacco product use, they don't understand as well. I mean, none of these people understand that well, but the older get it much worse. And lastly, if we go to educational attainment, this is going the other way, right? So less than GED is the reference, but you see that there is better understanding as you go forward in education. So if we're looking at the impact of tobacco product use, the impact of nicotine on a population level, and if we're looking at that through kind of a health equity lens, we really need to correct these misperceptions, and we have target populations in the groups that are most susceptible and most at risk for harm from tobacco who are doing worse. So, you know, when we think about health equity, we can think about how this messaging, this correction of misperceptions around nicotine can be really foundational to that. So now that you guys know everything, I'm going to move to my fantastic speakers. So we are going to start with Jessica Ziniak.
Got it.
Yes, okay. Jessica has a doctorate in social psychology with specialization in statistics. She has led research teams involved with work at CDC, NIH, and the National Science Foundation. She spent 6 years at Altria, leading perception and behavior studies, and she now serves as a chief research officer of Applied Research and Analysis Company, a boutique firm conducting perception, behavioral, and longitudinal studies in support of PMTAs and MRTPs. Today she's going to talk to us about her experience in actually speaking with consumers about nicotine and tobacco harm reduction products and how these perceptions impact their behavior. So, thank you.
All right, good morning. Good to see everybody. So it's kind of interesting that this is going to feed right into exactly what I planned to talk about, Brian, so I love how you kind of set that up, made it easy for me. So taking a step back, I want us to keep in mind for the next 2 days, not necessarily our business objectives, but I want us to be an adult smoker here in the United States. So Brian set this up really well, unplanned. But what I want you all to think about is who the adult smoker is. What is the general demographics of a smoker that we're trying to target? So before I get into this conversation about risk and misperceptions of risk and how that impacts harm reduction, we're going to become an adult smoker. So if we look at the African American population, about 3 in 4 African Americans smoke combustible cigarettes, predominantly menthol, which is a different discussion when we talk about potential menthol bans and then the lack of approval of menthol vapes. We see combustible cigarette use is high among American Indians, Alaska Natives, and when we look at that, we're looking at people who are living in poverty. About 40% of them have kids in their household, and they're living in poverty, and they're in unfit conditions to even potentially have heat in their houses. We're looking at people who are smokers, typically have mental health disorders and issues, whether that's depression, anxiety, nervousness. They're on medications for it typically. And where are my pictures aren't coming up. Uh-oh, how do I get back? There we go. And as Brian referenced, they have less than a high school degree. They are typically making less than $25,000 a year. They are older, right, 45 to 64. Most of them have some type of other disability. They are not us, right? So we are here trying to develop reduced risk products. We're here to try and develop communication messages to a population. We're trying to develop policies to a population that we are not, which is sometimes why I believe it's pretty ineffective. So let's keep this in mind, who our consumer is and who we are trying to benefit. They're switching from a cigarette, which we know is most harmful to them, to a potentially reduced risk product. As Brian mentioned, I'm a behavioral scientist by training, psychologist, and I'm going to come at this presentation through the lens of the smoker and through the consumer. I travel around the country, our team does, pretty much weekly, talking to consumers. And while it seems dim and gloom when you look at the statistics, the other side of it is amazing to see, because all right, this isn't loading, don't know. The other world of smokers, what you should see is the pictures are not coming up, is that they say, but I'm hopeful. I believe one day I'm going to quit cigarettes. They've tried, but they have failed. So again, while they are stressed out, they have potential psychological distress, they have very little income, they still believe that they can put down their combustible cigarette. And I think it's on us in this room to help them do that. Part of the issue, as I'm going to get into, is this misperception of risk that they have. And this sucks because my I don't know what's going on with the pictures. Okay. So as you see here, this really beautiful picture of a pyramid. And so what I wanted to take a step back and bring a psychological perspective to this. And when we think about smokers, we think about their perceptions of risk, their misperceptions, and quitting and their ability to quit smoking. I'm not sure if anyone has. Yes, woo, look at that. So the other world of smokers, I wanted to bring up this quote. They struggle, right, again and again, and then they say, one day I'm going to do it. And that's pretty amazing to walk away knowing that they still have a little bit of faith that they can do it. There we go, beautiful pyramid. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, very basic psychological assertion that has been shown and demonstrated over and over again in research. We need to keep this in mind. So what this is showing is that as you go up the pyramid, you get into more complex behaviors, cognitions and thoughts, and needs of an individual. And this has been shown across cultures. This is a very basic to us as individuals, this phenomenon. So we look at the bottom. These are physiological needs that every person living is required to meet. And the assertion is we cannot reach the higher order and those higher order needs of this pyramid unless the lower order needs are met. So again, let's talk about a smoker, right, in America today. If they're making less than $25,000 a year, they're not educated, they are living in poverty, maybe some of them can't even meet their physiological needs, right, with food, water, air. So how on earth, when we talk about perceptions of risk, are we going to get to this level of esteem and self-actualization? So in order for us to present information about risk perceptions to the public, we need them to be all the way up to the top to be able to accept the facts that we're presenting to them. We also know that when we talk about behavior change, and again, whether that's smoking cigarettes or changing misperceptions of risk, individuals need to feel confident, they need to feel like they can achieve it, they need to feel that they have the esteem to continue the behavior change. So I think we need to be considering this when we talk about here in a few minutes, how on earth are we going to change these misperceptions of risk? We have to again remember where the people are on this hierarchy. I think this is the most important aspect and phenomenon of human behavior, and I don't think it's applied enough within the industry. I do know that having been in public health before, worked with FDA and NIH, they apply this principle really well. So what we know is that behavior change is most effective with positive reinforcement. And anyone that has kids in this room can probably agree with that. Positive reinforcement is you're applying a stimulus, you're applying something to an individual because you want to increase that behavior. You want to change behavior. And if anybody wants to nerd out and geek out on this quadrant later, I'd be happy to do that. But if we want to change behavior, so if we want to change the misperceptions of risk, the best thing that we can do is we can apply something, whether or not that's information, whether or not that's some type of reward for them to actually engage in the behavior you want them to engage in. In this instance, it's either the understanding or the awareness of the risk perception, or it's the behavior change of putting down cigarettes and going to a potentially reduced harm product. Interestingly, when we think about this and the perceptions of risk, the warning, which we know is required, that warning is a positive punishment. That is the government's regulation to apply a stimulus, which is information, risk information, to try and reduce behavior, right? So it's on your cigarette pack, it's on your nicotine tobacco products, which is an application of a stimulus because they want people not to do it, okay? So that's positive punishment. That is ineffective when someone is engaging in behavior consistently over and over and over again. And that is one thing we see consistently every week in talking to consumers. That warning does nothing when someone has been using nicotine tobacco for several years. It does absolutely nothing. In fact, they completely have habituated to it and don't even read it. Now, what the FDA does very well in that regulation is when there's a novel product, so think e-vapor products, nicotine oral products, that actually does do something. So in that instance, it is an effective, positive punishment tool. Ineffective, again, when you're having viewed it consistently, but very effective because, as I'll get to, qualitative research is very important when you're talking about misperceptions. And what I hear continuously over and over again in talking to consumers is, and these are new products, right? So these are novel products, is no, like I'm just gonna keep smoking. Like you're telling me do not touch, it says, it may be harmful if you touch it. Keep out of hands of children. Don't let your pets near it. There's all types of warning. And that's actually deterring consumers from trying potentially reduced harm products. And in fact, without, again, displaying or mentioning confidential information, I will never forget, I walked out of a room of smokers who would not try a novel oral product because they believed, based on the warning and information on the pack, that it was more harmful than their combustible cigarettes. So just take that in for a second. So we need to then be considering, what are we telling our consumers on packs? What are we being forced to tell our consumers on packs of novel products, and how that's going to impact them from not even trying them because they literally believe they're more harmful than their combustible cigarette. So let's dive into some data. So as Brian mentioned, when I was at Altria, led many TPPI studies and do that now at ARAC. And we presented this, most brilliant researchers I've probably ever worked with at Altria, back in 2018. So that, 5 years ago? And the data was collected in 2017. And we were presenting information that there were misperceptions of risk back then, and I don't think it was capturing the audience at that time. It certainly has now, because I'm hearing it more and more. But let's pull out one of just most amazing findings, I feel like, when we look at, oops, nope, now I need to go back. And sorry if that's not, you can't see that. It might not be big enough. Okay, so we asked consumers, and we asked adult smokers, e-vapor users. This was specific to our application, MARC-10, and so an e-vapor product. And we looked at basically the perceptions of risk of cigarettes versus an e-vapor product. The take-home story here, this has been shown over and over and over again in research, so it's probably nothing new. And again, we presented this in 2018 at TSRC, but or SRNT, back when we were able to go. And basically what you're seeing is roughly 50%, almost 50% in some conditions, were saying that MARC-10 was equally risky or more risky than combustible cigarettes. And when you show consumers the marketing, the advertising, the actual product itself, that's when the percentages go up and increase. So we have to ask ourselves, what information do they have currently? And then once they go to the retail shop, or they go online, or they go to the store, how are their perceptions of risk changing? And as I mentioned earlier, with new products, with the warnings, with that negative information, it's actually going to do the reverse of what we want it to do. They are going to think it is more harmful, and as you see, there are significant increases in thinking it's more harmful than cigarettes after they see the actual marketing of an e-vapor product. More data, I'm not going to go into that, but we saw that consistently misperceptions compared to NRTs. We see that compared to quitting combustible cigarettes. And this is but this is quantitative data, right? So you've got hard numbers. I always like to talk to people about incorporating the qualitative data, because you can have numbers all day, but you don't then understand the why and the context behind it unless you add in some of the qualitative research. So before I hand it off, we know, based on, again, numbers, quant data from TPPI studies, we know based on qualitative research, talking with consumers, hundreds of consumers, thousands really, that they do not understand risk, right? They do not understand the risk continuum. They, being a smoker today, they're exhausted. I would encourage you, if you ever have an opportunity to go with your research team and talk with consumers, you will have an entirely different lens of an adult smoker today. They're exhausted. They're they're tired of trying. They're tired of all the information that they're bombarded with. They look to their physician, as Brian said. That's the one, that's the people they trust. And sometimes they don't even trust them. And one reason is because these consumers feel that their physicians have pushed them to NRTs, and NRTs have been very ineffective for them. And so while they trust physicians more so than, say, the government or industry, manufacturers, they still start to lose that trust, right? When they turn to them and they give them a product that's not working for them, and it leads them back to cigarettes. We also know that they don't have a lot of time. We're talking about people who are maybe working 3 jobs, who have kids at home. They don't have time to process information. So when we're thinking that they have misperceptions of risk, what are the best communication channels to get the information to them? And how can we make sure that they're receiving the correct information? So we know there's misunderstanding, and we know it's impacting behavior. We know that switching can occur when your needs are met, right? Look back to the basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Their basic needs must be met. People continue to do what they're confident in doing, especially when they're not able to reach that higher actualization of the hierarchy of needs. They're just going to keep doing what they know that they can do. We know that positive reinforcement works. We know that consumers are diverse. They trust different audiences, as I mentioned. And, there's a little piece here that I feel like social media has done very negative things when it comes to communicating risk perception, especially, with the Valley situation, and nobody's really come out and said, hey, guess what? It wasn't real vapor products. They were illegal, illicit products, right? So I can't tell you every single time I'm talking with consumers, they're saying, oh, e-vapor, you'll die. Like it goes to your lungs, and people are, you'll go to the hospital. I'm not going to try that. So where is the communication about that situation, and to know that they were not legitimate products that were causing that? So I believe social media is a channel that we should be using to potentially change behavior and change misperceptions. So I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So I will pause and hand it over to the next person, Brian.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessica. I think a lot of us, get pretty tunnel vision in our day-to-day lives, and it's really important to remember that it is people who smoke who really, it's where the rubber meets the road, right? We can't have great change unless we understand the people who smoke and we understand their motivations and their understanding. Okay, so we're going satellite. Our next speaker is Cliff Douglas. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He is an expert in tobacco-related policy and regulatory and legal issues. He has served as the American Cancer Society's Vice President of Tobacco Control, overseeing policy issues and public education campaigns. He has served as an advisor in several roles to the U.S. Secretary of Health, the U.S. Surgeon General, and many different people at the HHS. He currently serves as the director of the University of Michigan Tobacco Research Network. And I currently see him. Welcome, Cliff. And today he's going to talk a bit about where these misperceptions are coming from. Yeah. So with that, Cliff Douglas.
Very good, thanks, Brian. And I want to just do a sound check. Can you hear me clearly?
All good.
All right, very good, thank you. Well, from here, good morning. I'm currently out in Vancouver, Canada, so it's been a dark and early start to the day. I want to thank Brian for leading this discussion and also for your kind introduction, and thank you all for welcoming me from afar. It's good to be here to address what obviously is an important topic in this area, in your field, my field. We often discuss the need to incentivize the move away from cigarettes, and everyone here is aware of the urgent public health need to do so. It doesn't need saying, but I'll just start with the fact that combustible tobacco use is responsible for the overwhelming majority, and we're probably talking 98, 99% of tobacco-related deaths more than 1,300 every day in the US alone. And at the same time, I'm not aware of any credibly documented cases of an individual dying from exposure to the aerosol of nicotine-based e-cigarettes. Obviously, that is as distinguished from the unique and short-term phenomenon of so-called valley over 3 years ago. Now, that said, we're going to learn more about any potential long-term health effects of these products as the years pass, and research into longer-term exposure continues to be conducted. As highlighted by Neil Benowitz and others, the harms of long-term inhalation of nicotine without tobacco combustion haven't yet been determined and are going to require further study. But what we do know now is that long-term nicotine use, while not harmless, is magnitudes less harmful than cigarette smoking, as Dr. Benowitz, who served as chief editor of the Surgeon General's report on nicotine addiction, has also confirmed. There's a new commentary that kicks off the current issue of the journal Nicotine and Tobacco Research, and in that commentary, Dr. Leon Shahab begins by noting, and I like the way he began this, our field has a difficult relationship with nicotine. And in those 8 understated words, Dr. Shahab captures the moment. We have a very difficult relationship with this chemical, which fuels dependency on a product that will kill half of long-term users, while at the same time in other forms plays a quite positive role of helping some of those who smoke to quit, or at least to stop using the most harmful form of nicotine delivery. So given this dynamic, unpacking and effectively addressing nicotine misperceptions could hardly be more important. There is, as you know, and we've seen, a serious misperception problem. It has dire consequences for decision-making by adults who smoke. And as a result of, as Brian discussed, misinformation, disinformation, and also the dissemination of selective information, such as by focusing only or primarily on youth, many people who smoke are less likely to use approved nicotine replacement medications, not to mention reduced harm products such as e-cigarettes or snus or lozenges or pouches. And even if they do use those products, they're consequently less likely to use them consistently and more likely to revert to exclusive smoking. There was a study published last year by a group of my former scientific colleagues at the American Cancer Society, one of whom, by the way, I'm pleased to note was one of my public health graduate students back at Michigan. And in that study, they reported that U.S. adults' relative harm perceptions of e-cigarettes versus cigarettes changed during the Valley period, mostly occurring in late 2019, and then during the COVID-19 pandemic starting in early 2020. And notably, the ACS study was based on data from the respected Health Information National Trends Survey, or HINTS, that was collected in 2018 through 2020. So it's one of the more current data sets. The study showed not just that the perceptions of the harmfulness of e-cigarettes increased during that 3-year period, but that harm perceptions appeared to drive behavior changes, with respondents with higher e-cigarette harm perceptions being more likely to exclusively smoke, and those having lower e-cigarette harm perceptions being more likely to exclusively vape. And by the way, I'd like to note the fact that such research continues to be produced by the American Cancer Society is important. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the messengers in all of this. But ACS remains one of our more trusted institutions during this time of deep mistrust that folks experience in society. And it's also true, of course, that ACS's Cancer Action Network, which is their C4 lobbying arm, doesn't necessarily align its policy advocacy positions with such scientific findings, and that's problematic. So again, our field has a difficult relationship with nicotine. Incidentally, another area that gets less attention is the impact of misperceptions on people who don't smoke. The little research that does exist in that area indicates that holding incorrect information about relative risk is associated with a greater willingness to impose policies on e-cigarettes that match, inappropriately in some cases, regulations imposed on combustibles. So this is probably intuitive. Why would you apply different regulations on products that you perceive to be similarly dangerous? So the impact is not only on perceptions and behavior, but also on policy setting. While that's obviously worrisome from the perspective of the general public, even more concerning, I think, is the evidence that we've been hearing about already this morning from Michael Steinberg and colleagues at Rutgers about the relative risk misperceptions held by physicians, and particularly their deep misunderstanding of the role or lack thereof of nicotine on tobacco-related disease. Doctors are supposed to be our experts, and they, of course, have major influence on the public as well as on policy regulation. As Dr. Shahab also highlights in his commentary, Michael Russell famously wrote back in the 1970s that people smoke for nicotine, but they die from the tar. And while that may sound self-evident today to those of us who are well informed about it, that conclusion that he drew paved the road for the development of smoking cessation treatments in the 1970s and 80s. And more recently, the emergence of e-cigarettes has made harm reduction a reality, which is also quite relevant to Dr. Russell's statement back then. And yet, almost half a century after he helped the world understand, or presumably understand, the role played by nicotine versus the deadly impact of the toxic and carcinogenic chemicals produced in tobacco smoke, many of our doctors don't get it. So there's a lot of work to do to overcome misperceptions and make good on the promise of tobacco harm reduction. And that really, I think, underpins the value of our conversation today. So I said that I'd share just a few observations about the messengers for this information, because any discussion of nicotine misperceptions and harm reduction needs to take into account where the information is coming from and who is communicating it. Sources are really widespread. They include government agencies, particularly FDA and CDC, but also other figures like the Surgeon General and state and local health officials, members of industry, of course, the tobacco control and public health advocacy groups, the foundations that help fund them. Bloomberg comes to mind, state quitline services, political decision makers, and traditional and social media, and I've probably left some out. So there are a lot of messengers involved, and they come from a multitude of directions. They have different goals and responsibilities, different levels of accountability and to whom that accountability applies or is directed, and widely varying reputations, and I think this is important, for truthfulness and trustworthiness. And there are also a lot of cross-influences among them. And some of these messengers, such as state and local governments and media, to take a couple of examples, rely upon CDC and major advocacy and professional organizations for their information. So that's probably why your city or county health department's website may well still have an entire web page, as I think is the case in Detroit, devoted to highlighting the dangers of e-cigarettes based on eValley. And it's also why I was honored to join 6 highly credentialed colleagues led by Mike Pesco at Georgia State University in publishing our commentary titled United States Public Health Officials Need to Correct E-Cigarette Health Misinformation in the journal Addiction last December. In our piece in Addiction, we noted that despite the evidence, CDC continues including e-cigarettes in the name eValley, which has affected news coverage and contributed to distorted consumer beliefs about the risks of nicotine vaping. People who smoke are twice as likely to identify nicotine e-cigarettes as the cause of eValley than to correctly identify illicit adulterated THC products. And thus far, CDC has not yet made any changes in that regard, and health groups, as far as I've seen, haven't taken any significant steps to correct this misunderstanding, and perhaps that's because it's convenient to let it have more shelf life. So to conclude, I'll just touch a little bit on the roles of FDA and tobacco manufacturers. Because of restrictions on reduced risk messaging in the absence of an MRTP order, and even there the flexibility to tell the full story is fairly narrow, the primary burden is on the FDA to take responsibility for messaging more clearly and assertively to the public about the continuum of risk, which the agency and Brian King on many occasions has reaffirmed continues to be the focus of the agency. At the same time, and I'm not sure that I've heard this discussed elsewhere or much, it doesn't appear to me that Section 911 of the Tobacco Control Act, which sets forth the MRTP process, prohibits you, the manufacturers, from communicating generally about the continuum of risk. Doing so might raise the hackles of some. I think it probably would be worth that in any case, but it can be done with accuracy, without specificity relating to any particular product, and potentially contribute to public understanding. I think that if we agree that promoting the concept of tobacco harm reduction and the transition of industry from combustible to non-combustible products is an urgent priority, then all stakeholders should step forward to make the case, even if it involves some hurdles. The challenge that manufacturers face is obviously the credibility gap, to which I say now, in April 2023, do everything possible to exercise transparency, to tell the truth and keep telling the truth about the net benefits of using non-combustibles versus lethal smoked products. For its part, going back to FDA, I think the agency needs to amplify in a targeted and responsible way, at a level that it hasn't yet done, the essential message inherent in an APPH, or appropriate for protection of public health, finding for a tobacco product, that an adult who smokes and who cannot or will not quit all use of nicotine can reduce their risk by switching completely. And if FDA wants to add that it would then be ideal for that switcher to eventually quit the APPH product too, well, they're certainly free to do that. FDA should be assertively defending and explaining, I think more proactively, its marketing granted orders to the audiences, people who smoke, healthcare practitioners, smoking cessation counselors, and so on, who most need to hear it so that they can change their health behaviors based on a growing understanding of the risk continuum. It shouldn't be overly challenging to construct appropriate messages, even though we really haven't been seeing much of them out there. For example, Warner, Benowitz, McNeil, and Rigotti, who are top of the field, just published a terrific article in Nature Medicine titled "Nicotine E-Cigarettes as a Tool for Smoking Cessation," in which they recommend, in some detail, clear and very specific guidance that healthcare professionals can utilize in communications with people who smoke and those who don't. And I think finally that FDA really does need to stop its rote recitation every time it issues an MGO that no tobacco product is safe. It's technically accurate, of course, and also pretty much wholly unhelpful with reference to public understanding of relative risk. They can say that no tobacco product is absolutely safe, but that the authorized product, based on FDA's careful review, reduces health risk for the adult smoker who switches. The agency may justify the current statement on the grounds that there is still some risk and/or that we don't have decades of safety data yet. That's true. But that's true of any newly authorized medicine or vaccine, including COVID vaccines. There's almost always some risk, or there is always some risk with almost anything. So that type of language and parsing of language to the public is the kind of thing that I think is going to help move the ball down the field in this complicated game. And again, we've got multiple messengers who can play a role, different roles, but which all ought to become complementary and I think synergistic, and we will make progress. So I'm going to stop there. I look forward to the discussion, and I just want to thank you all for the privilege of your time.
Thanks very much, Cliff. We'll just hang out. We'll get to you in a minute. I got some follow-ups for you. But right now, our last speaker of the day is Thad Hennell. He is a principal scientist in population science at Altria, where he uses statistics and computational modeling to evaluate the impact of reduced-risk products. So his talk's really going to go over how these misperceptions can drive behavior and how that change in behavior can really have an impact on the population level. So to you, Thad.
All right. Thank you, Brian, and good morning, everyone. So just to start with a little background, as Brian mentioned, at Altria, part of my role is working with the team responsible for the development and implementation of population models, which are used to support our regulatory applications. These models allow us to evaluate the long-term population health impacts associated with the introduction of new products into the markets or the addition of modified risk claims on existing products. They can also help us answer, questions or inform policy-making decisions and answer questions relevant to today's discussion, which what I'm going to talk about is what would we expect or what could happen if we were able to correct misperceptions among adult smokers? What's the risk of doing nothing here? So I'm going to share some of the research that we've conducted on really quantifying the population health benefit or impact associated with varying levels of nicotine perceptions. Now, before I get into the modeling aspect of this, I'd just like to start with some of this data here from a recent survey we conducted. This nationwide survey looked at respondents 21 years of age and older and asked several questions, and one of the questions was if you believe, or the extent to which you agree, that nicotine is a carcinogen. What this data shows, again, is similar to what we've been talking about here so far. You've heard some of this data, and it's consistent with what's been published over the, I would say, the last decade or so. Here we see among the general population, 80% strongly or somewhat agreeing that nicotine is a carcinogen. Looking at adults who smoke within this population, again, as we've seen today, high levels of misperceptions around the risk of nicotine. And again, as was shown earlier today as well, if we look at specific demographics within adult smokers, we see Black and Hispanic adults who smoke holding high misperceptions regarding the risk of nicotine. Now, again, that's important because, as Brian, you laid out, while nicotine being addictive, it's not directly responsible for the major smoking-related morbidity and mortality. In a recent interview, Commissioner Califf, FDA Commissioner Dr. Califf, recently stated that he believes misinformation to be the leading cause of death in the United States right now. Now, clearly, Dr. Califf wasn't talking about nicotine and tobacco, but I think the point translates to the discussion today. We see that this inaccurate information among adult smokers as potentially being a barrier to moving down the continuum of risk. And so that's really where we wanted to use our modeling to try to understand or to quantify just this potential barrier and its impacts. So to do that, we started with data from the Population Assessment of Tobacco and Health Survey, or study. This is a nationally representative longitudinal cohort study. It's funded by the FDA and others. And looking at wave 4 from this data, what you see here are the results from adult smokers in which they were asked if they believe nicotine is the chemical that causes most of the cancer caused by smoking. And what we see here, again, as with previous waves of PATH, a majority of adult smokers holding misperception of nicotine. And as we look down this scale, you can even see here the smallest proportion, 7%, indicated that nicotine definitely was not the chemical causing most of the cancer caused by smoking cigarettes. Now, as I mentioned about PATH, it's longitudinal data, so we can follow up with these adult smokers in the very next wave. When we do that, we see that just under 4% indicated or responded that they were no longer smoking and currently using smoke-free products every day or someday. And that in PATH includes e-vapor, electronic nicotine delivery systems, smokeless tobacco, and snus. And so what I think the really interesting piece of this is what happens when we stratify this transition rate by the responses to the nicotine perception question. And what we see here is a really interesting trend occurring, where for those who responded that nicotine definitely does not cause most of the cancer caused by smoking, you can see they're transitioning at rates more than twice the overall. As we go down that scale, those with misperceptions are transitioning lower than the overall rate. So you start to begin to see a clear harm reduction potential associated with switching to smoke-free products and holding the correct beliefs of nicotine harm. So this is what we used as inputs into our model. And I'll not get too heavy into modeling in this talk. It's a little bit too early for that anyway. But any model has a framework that starts with a base case. That base case is representative of the world today. Our base case is representative of the US population in terms of age, gender, tobacco use status, as well as a mix of nicotine perceptions. And in this model, you have never smokers who can initiate smoking, and then smokers who can quit. That's either exclusive quitting or through switching to smoke-free products. And the inputs for this, again, are based on PATH data or SysNet. And we use long-term, what we call long-term rates. And that means for a cigarette smoker in wave 1 who quit smoking in wave 2, we use the rate associated with them following through, maintaining that status through wave 5. So this base case, of course, and the modeling in general has assumptions and limitations that, of course, we have to consider, but we follow, as best we can, good modeling practices, and these models are validated. And so with the base case, we're going to compare that to alternate scenarios, or what we call a modified case. And the way we've set that up is to really look at 4 modified cases. And these correspond to those responses to the nicotine perception question that I was showing earlier. And so for each of these questions, we're adjusting the switching rate based on the relative percent change between the overall and stratified rate for each response group. Those were the rates I showed previously. And so what this shows is for any one of these scenarios, we would be looking at what would the population impact be if all adult smokers behaved like those in the definitely not response group or the definitely yes response group. And so we take the difference between these modified case scenarios and the base case, and this results in the population impact. So the result that I'm going to show today is here, and this is looking at the difference in mortality shown as premature deaths prevented. If there was no difference between the modified case and the base case, we would get a result of 0. And what you see here is that if we look at if all adult smokers behaved like those in the definitely not subgroup or response group, we would expect to see around 800,000 premature deaths prevented over a roughly 85-year period. As we go down that scale, you can see those with misperceptions. If all adult smokers behaved like those in the definitely yes response group, we would see additional mortality over what we currently expect to see. So the takeaway here is that correcting smokers' perceptions of nicotine harm has potential to result in a population health benefit. and failing to do so has potential to cause harm. And I would say, for those who are responding with misperceptions and the definitely yes or the probably yes subgroup, you can see their switch rates are much lower, and so there's harm associated with that. So that's what I had to share today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Thad. I wish you had left that up because that number is incredible. And that's why I love this population modeling work. It really shows you how these small changes in a known problem could have huge benefits to public health. Okay, so we got a little bit of time for questions. So I'm going to kick one off that for everyone on the panel. So feel free to jump in. Chris mentioned the Reagan-Udall evaluation in his opening. And as part of the response, the agency has said that it will take input on the formative research or research to communicate relative risk and correct misperceptions around nicotine to adults. So if you were giving your public input right now on what they should focus on and what they should consider as part of this research and as part of this plan to correct these misperceptions about nicotine and nicotine risk, what would you say? Cliff?
For that, I'm just making sure you still hear me.
Yep.
At the most basic level, and it was interesting. I'll just comment to start that when FDA responded and indicated, and I think it was Dr. Califf and Dr. King, indicated that they would pursue formative research. That's basically suggesting sort of de novo research. It's stuff that hasn't been done before. Well, we better start looking at this and figure out how to communicate to the public about these issues. I mean, I just have to be honest. I felt a small sense of disappointment that we're 14 years into the Tobacco Control Act, and we've got a massive urgent problem out there, and we better figure out how to talk to adults about nicotine and relative risk. It's a critical area, and that type of research, formative research, can involve focus grouping and the type of work that FDA is expert in. I mean, they've engaged in a lot of that work as part of the Real Cost campaign, messaging to youth about a lot of these issues. And Kathy Crosby is terrific. Some people here will know her. They can do a very good job on that. And I'm looking forward to their accelerating that and really getting it done as soon as possible, because for all of the reasons that, my thoughtful fellow panelists and yourself that we've been talking about so far, this is an urgent matter. A whole lot of people need to be far better educated. And the FDA is, I think, ground zero for engaging in that. But again, along with its sister HHS agency, CDC, they don't always speak the same language or even hold precisely the same views. That's a separate but related issue. But I do think that, and by the way, this is a little bit of inside baseball, but at HHS, when I was there working with with Dr. Koh, the Assistant Secretary for Health, and also Boris Lushniak, the acting SG at the time, we formed the HHS Steering Committee on Tobacco Control, and it consists of, and this public, consists of members, key representatives from many of the HHS agencies, and they gather on a regular basis to share information and to talk about these types of issues, CDC and FDA and SAMHSA and HRSA and NIH and a lot of other acronyms. And there are ways for them to coordinate and find common ground on what the public needs to understand and what HHS's gigantic realm of audiences need to understand here. So I do hope that under Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, whom I believe runs the committee now, they'll be pursuing a lot of discussion around this, and not because they heard about it from TMA and our manufacturers, but because they heard about it from all of us. So those are my initial thoughts, and I'm sure my colleagues will have some more to add.
Sure. Jessica?
Yeah, so I think that's great. And building off of that a little bit, my two things I first thought, one was exactly what you said, Cliff. This is not formative research. This is summative research, because we have already done the research. My concern with giving whether it's HHS, CDC, FDA, the reins, and only the reins, is how long it will take to get the information out to the public. So I was thinking an expert panel would be great to gather various experts in the field and come up with an e-learning potential curriculum, whether or not that be for healthcare providers, nurses, primary care physicians. But that would mean collaboration with industry. It would be with experts all across the area in the field. The other thing I think so that's kind of like the long game. I know I did that once with OWH, Office of Women's Health, and HHS for domestic violence for women, and it probably took us about 1.5 years to develop that program and to get that e-learning curriculum implemented. So the time is a constraint there. The other thing would be, for the more short term, would be social media. I do believe, the FDA does post frequently on LinkedIn and other areas, and I think if while developing this expert panel and perhaps this e-learning curriculum in conjunction with industry, if they could do it sounds silly because I'm kind of a millennial, but not really, but do posts, right? Do videos. That is what a typical consumer is looking at. It's quick, it gets the information, and then when they see it over and over again over time, it will change the perception.
Great, thanks. And Todd?
Yeah, I think in addition to focused information to adult smokers, I think FDA has the opportunity to authorize additional smoke-free products that will appeal to adult smokers to move them down the continuum of risk.
Great point.
Great. We're running a little late on time, so anybody in the audience have any questions? We got one back that way.
You'd make me walk all the way to the other side. Thanks. So quick question. You guys brought up the quote, people smoke for the nicotine, die from the tar. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the misperceptions of nicotine with very low nicotine cigarettes, and you could comment on that.
That's a great question. So was the MRTP designation directly related to nicotine? Does that add to misperceptions around nicotine itself? Anyone from the panel want to jump in?
I could say one thing. Honestly, I don't even think consumers begin to understand what very low nicotine means. And I do understand the question, and I think it's one that we need to be asking ourselves. But I think from a consumer's perspective, again, I talk with them all the time. I just don't think it means much to them. Again, they're looking for snippets of information and quick information. They're not into it like we are to know what is very low nicotine, what does it mean with combustion versus higher nicotine levels. I mean, when you give them a different potentially reduced harm product, they don't even know what nicotine level means, right? Like, what does milligram mean? What does 6 mean? They have no idea. So I don't have a direct answer, but I do think it contributes to just continued confusion.
It's a very good question. I'm glad that, and I don't know who asked the question, but I think you've raised an important issue because it's another tool in the, call it the tobacco prevention, tobacco control, and FDA armamentarium that has been regarded as important for a long time. I think that I was actually the first person to recommend nicotine reduction to non-addictive levels starting at around 1992. And then, of course, Dr. Benowitz and Dr. Henningfield, published their piece in 1994 advocating that we take a serious look at reducing nicotine to non-addictive levels. There's very good public health and scientific and policy very strong rationale, including modeling, showing that if FDA were to succeed in adopting its proposed standard, or what will become a proposed standard, to apply nicotine reduction across all combustible products, but parenthetically with the need to exercise great care and ward off what may be advocated, that it be applied to other products as well, which would, I think, be self-defeating. The confusion there is obvious. If a product has been authorized as an MRTP and people are given to understand that this product may benefit their health, and it's on the basis that nicotine has been removed at the simplest level, that's telling the uninitiated, people who are just, glancing at or coming across a product that happens to show up on a store shelf, the message that nicotine's the problem. And here, again, this goes back to what we're talking about today, which is the need for improving, strengthening, and simplifying communications around this. FDA, not to mention others of us, can say pretty simply, in ways that I don't think have broken through, and I think you were just highlighting it, nicotine is removed from this product, not because it makes the product safer, it's just as hazardous as any combustible product, any smoke product, but because it won't addict you. And it's an opportunity, in fact, to clarify for the consumer, for the public, what a product like that is all about, and to clarify the role that nicotine plays. That's at bottom what we're talking about here. But, as usual, this becomes subject of a kind of chaotic communications environment. People are confused about it. I honor the company that's produced the products that are on the market right now, but if anything like that is eventually going to succeed, and perhaps against all odds, I don't know if it will ever happen, I've hoped it will, it's going to have to be a market-wide standard that's applied, because having a couple of products out there of this nature in a marketplace that's saturated with everything else and is becoming more complicated is probably not going to make much of a mark on public health.
Okay. And with that, we're going to close this session. I really want to thank the organizers as well as my incredible panel. And I'd like to thank Matt Holman for not showing up, because you guys did a really great job without him. So I think we're going on a break now, yeah?
Yes, we are going on break.